All right, hey. Um, so I'm gonna talk a little bit about perspective and the role of perspective in something like simple character drawings with no backgrounds and stuff. So there are some pieces that you might feel that it's very immersive. You can look at the piece and you can see the 3D space that it's in. You can feel where the camera is, how it creates impact for the piece. And then there are pieces that you feel like because there's no background drawn onto the piece, it's just a pin-up character. You would feel like, oh, it's just a character against a backdrop. And then there are pieces that are like that, where it's a character with a background, but somehow it feels like there's some perspective to what you're looking at. And especially when it's a sort of graphic design piece where there's like text and whatever laid on top, and the backgrounds are a solid color for design purposes. Those pieces, the character drawing stands out a lot because of the fact that they can also bring you a sense of like camera angles and stuff. And usually we think about this in terms of, oh wow, this person can draw dynamic pieces, but it's hard for you to think, I'm gonna draw a dynamic picture. Because dynamic is an adjective. It describes a quality rather than the way you get to it. And the one of the things, like one of the concrete things that you can work on is perspective. And so um what I want to focus on today is not like how to draw in perspective, or how to use extreme perspectives to make your piece more dynamic. No, um, I want to talk about the role of like even just very simple perspective lines and how it will influence how you draw. So the difference between what you can imagine, like this great um, exciting piece, and what comes out on paper is usually the fact that when you're drawing your idea out, you're impacted by what you see on the screen, and usually that's a blank canvas. And what a blank canvas is a flat background. What you normally think about when you draw on a blank canvas like this is this kind of perspective. And it's just the same as, let's say, you're trying to paint lighting, like night lighting, but you're painting the characters first on a white background, and then you add in the dark blue night sky, and then you wonder why your characters' colors are wrong. So the next time around, you try to like use like dark pink or just like arbitrarily guess the lighting, and you can't get it. It's because of this thing that you see, and it makes your brain think, okay, this is light background no matter what. So the same thing here. If you draw on just a background and you don't think about any sort of perspective, like where the grid is at all, you're going to draw a figure that is just on this kind of front view, absolutely no vanishing point at all kind of angle. So the solution here is to help yourself see perspective. And to do that, you draw out grids. Even if the incline is really subtle, like instead of vertical lines, this slightly slants more to one side, or something like this. Even if the incline is really subtle, there is a grid here. Like if I were to draw a box, it would be like this. It would be sort of like this, rather than just straight up box with two sides, no sign of the third plane. And the concept's the same as sketching or laying down rough colors. The point of drawing this perspective is to help yourself see, help your brain think about this space not in a 2D flat straight up view, but like even a few degrees up and down, or even if it's a big canvas, and you can sort of see, let's say, Mm. Oh no, Photoshop. Work. This is so unfortunate. All right. So make a very gentle perspective grid here. And I draw a character around here. Here's the horizon. And I draw a character on this sort of perspective. Because this character's face is up here, I'm going to think, well, there's a sort of look up involved, so I'm going to draw their chin. And then the shoulder, I will make it a little bit higher than usual. And then as the body comes down here, I see, oh, so now the eye is pretty level, so my waistline for the character is going to be level. And then as you draw more to the bottom, based on the perspective, you feel like, well, not feel like, you know, that the feet should be like this kind of apart. And so just a simple side view character becomes like there's a space implied in here because your eyes were able to see these lines in concrete, and then your eyes draw these lines, your hands draw these lines into the characters, and then when that grid is gone, people see these lines as their anchors, their cues, their perspective cues on where the grid is, how far the camera is, where the character stands in space. And this helps, even if it's just a person standing there with nothing in the background, it helps makes the picture look more dynamic because there's more to understand. And the grid doesn't have to be complex as long as you know how vanishing points work. Like 1 point, 2 points. Usually 2 points is good to the size, and then it doesn't really matter what the vertical grid is, or if you want to see draw a picture that has more of a scale to it, so you want to draw something vast, tall building, really far up space, or like big mountains and stuff, you can also slant the vertical vanishing point as well. But just being able to see changes how you draw, and the changes in how you draw shows through to the viewer. So in this grid, I drew the grid first, and then I drew the characters. And this even applies to drawings that were done without a grid. So if you now look at this, just a sketch that I did, that I could use as an example. I mean for the sketch to have a solid color background. And because I drew it without the grid, without a grid, it just looks like what it is. It looks like you're looking at two characters straight on against a white background, no perspective involved. But just by, let's say, if I draw a grid in here, this, so basically in this grid, I could say, okay, let's draw a building in the back like this. And just by existence of the building, just this simple rectangle, it defines what space you are in, where you're looking at. Okay, from here, because of the building, you're looking at the characters from a little bit down below. She looks like she's jumping out of a window, and suddenly there is context to the piece, and it doesn't look like you're looking at something flat. And that's even after the fact. Like, I add the grids after the fact, and you don't need to draw this building in. You just need to take this grid, and it would help you like come up with things to, like, debris or whatever, or even using it to align, say, items in the back. Here I intended to draw some wings. I might align the two wings on either side like this, and then when I get rid of, oh, run. What? Okay, two wings like this, and when I get rid of the grid, this line will still be here. So this reference line will still be here, and then because of this alignments, people will see, they will start to notice that these lines on the characters are also here, and they also align with the perspective grid, and it gives you a sense of space in the piece. So something you draw in after the fact to help you add in a little bit of cues here and there would still add a lot to your character-centric piece. So here are some other sketches that I did a while ago, again for just like composition. That was the drawback of not having 3D models. You have to draw in a totally different, you draw in a completely new picture every time you want to change the angle a tiny bit just to see what it looks like. So here, despite there not being any background per se, there's just a wall of water here. I don't know if it's possible for you to understand this mess. But just a wall of water here, which only has like one plane to it. I still drew in the perspective grid, so I drew in the grid first before I drew in anything else. And this is an example of what the effect of the grid would be for your piece. Because of the grid, I sort of was able to see this plane of the birds. So let's say a giant flat piece of paper was in the sky. This would be the angle that you were looking at it at. And it allows me to draw the birds in perspective, or use the birds as perspective to show closer birds, farther away birds, and you sort of see that, oh, they are on the same plane. It's just conveying distance. And another thing is, it made me draw the character in an angle that, even though I had just intended for it to be like front view, the slight angle gives a third dimension to the piece and makes the view more involved. And so if I say, I wonder if I can get rid of okay, I can get rid of the background. Alright, hold on. I'll get rid of the grids as well. Here. Oops. So I got rid of the grids here. So now you can only see the whole effect of potential look of character against a white background. So let's say this was just a character against a white background and I never intended to draw in the background or drawing any of the birds or anything else to help give space context. So it would look kind of like this, right? But if I zoom in enough, you can see the effect of me drawing that grid, and that is, despite this being a drawing of a character profile against a white background, because of the grid, it made me draw her in perspective. It made me draw the underside of her chin a bit because it's an upward angle. It made me draw her chest higher, her collarbone a lot higher. It made me draw this shape for her collarbone instead of the usual like slightly down shape. Made me draw a little bit of the backside of her dress, and then you can see the change down here where the kneecaps becomes like front facing from say the boobs is top facing to the kneecaps being front facing. So there's a change in the span of the field of view here. And I did all this not because I was like, I'm going to make this look dynamic, but because I placed her within context of the perspective grid that I drew, and it guided me to draw a figure in the proper perspective. And so, like I said before, you don't really need to make a complex grid or make dynamic, slanted 3-point grids for everything. Even something as simple as, instead of drawing this kind of view in the first demo that I did, you just make a very minute, the slightest of slants for your grid, for your camera view. Just a tiny little bit, so that your box, instead of this, looks a little bit more like this, or looks a little bit more like this, will give your piece so much edge. And the reason why you don't see a lot of pros doing this, despite their pieces having this kind of quality to it, is that they've done this so often, they're so used to thinking of this perspective grid that they don't need to see it. They don't need to see it to be mindful of it. They see it as they draw. And it's the same thing as say Kim Jung-ji being able to just print out pictures in pen in one go without a sketch. It's not because like he knows anything that you would never learn. It's just because he's drawn so much, and that memory of what things he wants to draw look like is so ingrained in his mind that he doesn't need to actually draw it out to see it in sketch before he inks over his what he sees with fine lines. And but we're not like them, and so just dropping in a couple of these right before any of your drawings would most likely help you make your drawings look a lot more dynamic and spatially aware, and it would probably make it a lot easier for you to draw like objects in relations to each other properly as well.